The funding issue is a big one, a huge one, a massive one. Conversations about alternative funding and financing tools can be politically fraught, but are obviously critical in plotting the path to a more secure and resilient infrastructure future. Our next session is sponsored by PwC, and I will welcome a partner for integrated infrastructure for PwC Australia, Rayleigh Myers.
Right up here. Hello, I think I'm working. Rayleigh Myers, a partner in PwC Australia's infrastructure business. I advise government clients on business case and procurement of predominantly major transport projects. That's included PPP projects on Gold Coast Light Rail, Canberra Light Rail, high capacity trains, but as well as sort of more traditionally publicly funded projects. I've also spent the last, I'm going to call it 3 years, advising the Victorian Government on the Suburban Rail Loop project, which for those that haven't heard of, is a $35 billion stage one project. I think the total cost might be about 90 bill, it depends who you ask. But advising on the funding and financing strategy for that project, so pretty familiar with some of the challenges government's facing in making some funding decisions. We've got maybe 40 minutes for a panel conversation. I'm joined by a number of panel colleagues and looking forward to some curly questions. So get your questions ready. But Erina Sitterly. Erina joins us as head of the investment management policy at the Treasury in New Zealand. She has 15 years experience in public policy roles, including in the education, health and transport sectors. She's been with Treasury for 4 years and leads the policy function in the investment management system team. This includes responsibility for public investment policy settings and advice on prioritisation and sequencing of capital investment. Welcome, Erina. Next to Erina is Bevan Peachy, if that wasn't clear, Special Counsel Banking and Financing at Russell McVeagh. Bevan specialises in projects in the infrastructure and energy sectors, and has acted for public sector agencies, financial institutions, corporate borrowers and sponsors on a range of complex transactions. He's currently acting on 5 of the PPPs in New Zealand and has worked on a number of other infrastructure financing transactions. Brings a wealth of experience on innovative infrastructure financing and refinancing. Welcome, Bevan. And Sean, last but not least, Deputy CEO at Crown Infrastructure Partners, responsible for infrastructure funding and financing activities. Sean has been with Crown Infrastructure Partners for 10 years and was previously responsible for the commercial rollout of the ultra-fast broadband network. Prior to this, Sean was CEO at Independent Newspapers Limited and Director of Sales and Marketing at Telstra Saturn. So graduated from the university with a Bachelor of Laws. So we'll take some time with the panel, but I guess I wanted to start with a bit of some introductory remarks and perhaps thought provokers for your curly questions that are coming. We are talking about alternate funding and financing models. I was going to say we're talking about the success of alternate funding and financing models, which is perhaps a little bit misleading because I'm not sure there's been a huge amount of success stories in the area. Certainly it has been around alternate financing, but alternate funding models are still evolving. I think we've traditionally sort of looked at these large infrastructure projects to have the burden of funding on government. We look at the economic appraisal, we determine that there's a benefit, government funds the project and directs its taxes towards it. Essentially, everyone benefits, everyone pays. But I think there's a shift globally, and probably a welcome shift, to actually look at alternate funding models. So essentially really raising new revenue sources to fund projects, whether that's incremental charges on existing levies or introduction of new charges. Wrapped around that, obviously, then is some clever financial structuring, which I'm sure our panel will talk about, that really sort of is financing against those future revenue streams. But I think, like Richard touched on just earlier, it's important to sort of, for me, think about the financing structure is really just a way of accessing those funding sources. And so ultimately, I want my super fund to be invested in projects that will have a funding return. So ultimately, we still need the funding source. So I'm probably going to focus on funding, and I'm sure our panel will cover both funding and financing as we get there. So why now? Why are we talking about it now? I think it's kind of simple, really. There's sort of three real reasons why I think we're focusing on funding. Our projects are getting bigger. Multi-billion-dollar projects are the norm. We've talked about, the suburban rail loop. I know there's multi-billion-dollar projects here in New Zealand. Role myself sort of helping on Auckland Light Rail. So multi-billion dollars is normal. And as we get more expensive, I think we need to think differently about how we fund them. We also know a bit more. We kind of know that these projects deliver real benefits to our communities and our economies, but they also deliver benefits to direct parties. So property owners, landowners, developers. I'm sure we've heard the stories of people that have got the windfall gain just because they happen to be nearby a train station. So I think we sort of, as we understand what those benefits are, our ability to kind of tap into those benefits and introduce new charges that target those benefits also sort of increases. And third, there's the kind of simple one, fiscal constraints. Kind of simply, if government wants to deliver these much larger projects and meet the community expectations, including like sustainability that we've just sort of talked about earlier, they really need to think about new funding models. So, where's it been done? I guess there's lots of examples, and importantly, they've sort of not tried to replace the burden on traditional funding, but really to supplement it. So we have our traditional government funding sources, and then we're supplementing that with additional funding sources. I'm sure everybody here has heard about Crossrail London. Don't need to dwell on it, but I think it's about 30% of their, estimated capital cost. I'm sure it's a bit different on the actual capital cost, but 30% from alternate funding sources, including primarily business rate supplements. So for me, an existing rate, easy to access, nice annual revenue stream, easy to finance against, but importantly, and I think what's perhaps most important and the lesson learned from this project is that there was a real community or business community desire for that project. And I think the sort of main learning and the discussions I've had on the project have been, government made it really clear they couldn't deliver it without support. They couldn't deliver it with traditional funding, and there was a real strong need for the project. I needed to get more people into London, business bought into that. And then their ability to sort of accept and understand a business rate supplement that ultimately contributed a significant amount to the project was able to be achieved. There's plenty of other examples globally, Grand Paris Express, supplements on existing taxes, the Rail Infrastructure Fund in Switzerland, probably not too dissimilar to your National Land Transport Fund here, but sort of approaches to sort of introduce and quarantine funding towards particular projects. Back in Australia, we've got plenty of toll roads, varying successes. We can probably talk about those in a financial structuring context. But clearly, the introduction of tolls is a pretty well understood funding source. Gold Coast Light Rail, another example that's is perhaps familiar over here, but the introduction by Gold Coast City Council of a levy on existing properties across the town, funded I think 10% of the capital cost of stage one, which doesn't sound like much, but in the context of a project at the time, traditionally been government funded by federal and state levels, the introduction of a local council levy across the town was a pretty big move, and I think ultimately successful and had a lot of buy-in on the project. And then there's the suburban rail loop, and as I said, I've probably been involved in this one for about 3 years, so I could probably talk for a lot longer on it. I'll try not to. Government's made some pretty difficult decisions in that project, and they have announced three funding models on top of sort of state-led or government-led land development. But incremental land transfer duties on commercial properties, I think commercial, the key word there, they've avoided or made the choice not to charge on residential properties. Development contributions on new development activity. And a sort of interesting nuance in that one is it's on expected value creation from the development, not on an infrastructure cost recovery charge. And there is a nuance to that, which I'm happy to explore later as well. And car parking levies. So nice little bonus one, we get some funding as well as managing road congestion and get people onto the trains. There's plenty of other sort of smaller examples, but I think the main thing is that they've tended to leverage existing systems. So they've not tried to create something new. They've really sort of tapped into what is already there. And when you start to look at sort of some of those, that also means that they're quite predictable, they're quite stable. understand what's coming, and therefore I can finance around them more easily. So I'm conscious of time. I would just say that probably, before we jump into questions, there's probably 4 areas that we can think about imposing sort of questions on how to go about funding models and the lessons that we've learned. And it's really around, kind of simple questions. Where do I apply the charge? So which beneficiary do I apply it to? How much do I charge and when do I start? So pretty simple, the distinction I made with Suburban Rail Loop, for example. Is it residential or commercial? Is it property owners? Is it landlords or tenants? You can imagine some of those debates when government's making the decision to introduce the charge. When we start to look at some of the property-based charges, we look at where do I draw the line on the map? Which properties get it? What happens at the border? How far away is the border from that sort of central creation? And there's a big choice to be made there. When? Is it at the start? Is it during construction when I'm actually facing all of the pain of construction, but I know that it'll be worth it in the end? So do I put the charge in place sort of during construction, or do I wait when the value's actually been realised? So the when is a difficult choice as well. And then there's the how much, and we probably could debate how much a lot, but clearly the challenge for the how much is what do I get out of it? How do I attribute value to me that then can justify the charge that you've imposed upon me? I think that attribution sort of question is probably one of the bigger ones. I could then jump into all sorts of financial structuring, but I'm clearly gone over time here and we need to hear from the panel. So I'm just going to wrap up at that, but just to say, clearly alternate funding isn't the panacea to large infrastructure funding problems. It needs to work in existence with the tax system, it needs to work with the private sector and financial structuring. And it, most importantly for me, needs to work with community. I think as we keep this conversation going, keep the conversation alive of what alternate funding models are, and help the community understand the benefits of these projects, the value that they're sort of getting out of them, and then why for we should contribute. So to start the conversation, here we are. Thank you. I think questions can start coming. I'm going to kick things off with you, Erina. I've got a pre-prepared one, as you could imagine. But Erina, with someone that's sort of focused on policy settings and the sort of value created by these projects, how can we sort of make project decisions that increase value that then can sort of help us tap into that alternate funding?
Yeah, I think I'll channel some of the earlier speakers today when they were talking about the need for sort of a consistent strategic vision and outcomes. I think that's where we have to start, and then understanding within that, say for a city or a region or a country, where a particular project fits into that. And that has got to be something that's sort of coherent and resonates with people, with communities, with decision makers, and also needs to be realistic and tangible, I think. People need to be able to understand, how is this going to make my life better? How is this going to, improve our communities? And that I think is needed, that consistency is needed to build trust and credibility about, is this going to happen? What is the plan going forward? And then also, I think there needs to be earlier conversation around, so there's conversations around benefits, how my life will improve as a result of this project, but also on the cost side as well. So early conversations that, early in a project, you won't necessarily know the exact cost of it, but I think you're starting to socialise the theory around user pays or beneficiary pays is important. And then if people can connect that with the benefits they'll be getting, when sort of the rubber hits the road in terms of the actual charges that might be talked about, that that may be an easier conversation to have. But I think it's important to be had early so people understand it. And it also goes to, I think, affordability and sort of distributional impacts of that as well need to be understood early as part of the policy process, because there needs to be an understanding of whether this is something that's actually feasible and is going to be affordable. And that also needs to be factored into sort of the value of the project as a whole, actually.
I'm sure we could have a whole other panel discussion on project affordability and sort of increasing costs. Thanks, Erin. I'm going to pass on. There's a couple of questions coming through here that maybe, Sean, I'll start with you on IFF. And so there's sort of a mix, I guess, of sort of questions around the sophistication of those models, the sort of, you know, attractiveness of them, but yet we haven't really seen too many transactions, maybe one so far. So what are the barriers really to IFF, and how can we make that more attractive and approachable for some of our local?
Yeah, Ray, you know, IFF does have a degree of complexity and process to it. That was actually deliberate. If you step back to what IFF really is, it's the Crown handing over a power to tax to somebody that's not a core part of the Crown, and so that's something normally the Crown doesn't do. It protects that taxation right very carefully. It's obviously got real concerns that it's used appropriately, that beneficiaries and levy payers are dealt with in a fair manner, and that what's being proposed is affordable. So there is a sort of a rationale for why there is complexity there, and potentially some of that complexity as we start going on IFF projects with meaningful numbers, maybe we can some of that can fall to the sides. But if you think of you know, a standard IFF project where we've got a project, we're ready to go with it, CIP will establish a special purpose vehicle. We will invest our own equity in that, we'll go and raise debt, and there will be funding available there for the project that the project can draw down. And then obviously to repay that debt over time, the levy payers, the people who benefit, who we've identified and we've allocated the benefits between them, they're going to be charged you know, a reasonable, affordable amount of levies over lengthy periods of times. So because of all of that, you want to have really good, robust systems around it, and not just have an entity like Crown Infrastructure Partners making all of those decisions. So that's sort of some of the rationale for that. For sort of what are we thinking now that we've completed one project and we're about to close our second project? So in November last year, we completed a project with Tauranga City Council. They had a package of roading projects that they wished to continue construction of. We were able to provide them with $177 million of funding for that, and a reasonable levy was charged, and that levy was around the sort of $77 level. Going through that process, it was reasonably lengthy. It's not just the IFF process, but actually the process of getting all the construction into the positions where you actually can finalise a transaction. So land acquisition, consents, resource management issues and the like. We got some pretty good learnings out of that project, and we're currently in the final stages of closing our second project, which is with Wellington City Council, and it's a project which is a large facility that's called a sludge minimisation facility. And it is going to be a key part of Wellington's wastewater network and for the city to get to carbon neutrality. So coming out of those two projects, we've got some learnings, and we think those learnings are really going to assist with getting more of a pipeline and a consistent flow of projects coming out. The first learning we have is there are a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders in the process that when IFF was developed, I think the thinking was you'd sequentially go through the processes. So CIP would work as a facilitator with city councils. We'd work with them to develop what's called a levy proposal. Once you had your levy proposal, you'd take it to the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development, and they'd consider it and get all their advisors. Then it would go to Treasury, who would consider it from a sort of impact on the Crown and impact on a thing called a government support package, which is given. We all quickly realised that if you worked through that on a sequential basis, you'd be doing this forever. So we made the decision that on day one, we'd have all of our stakeholders in the room, and we'd have a totally collaborative approach where you'd have Treasury, MHUD, Council, ourselves, and get all issues, have issues resolved so they're being resolved once rather than as it goes through the system. And that led to that part of the process speeding up well. A second learning that we're getting is the understanding of IFF down to quite a deep detail is really starting to come through, and we're especially seeing that with the financiers that we deal with. So we have a senior debt panel of financiers, and they've now worked through the two transactions that I mentioned, and have got a really good understanding of both the model and the types of finance that will work best in that model. So that's sort of the second learning. Third learning is we think that there's a couple of tweaks to the legislation, so some statutory changes that'll take quite a lot of time out of the process, and so we're working with officials and would expect to get some changes made that we think is going to lead to streamlining. And then the fourth change is we're actually seeing that we're seeking to move to a more sort of modular approach with IFF and to sort of have on project sizes, small, medium and large projects. And for small projects, and they probably sit in the sort of greenfield type environment, so new housing development, where developers might be looking for up to $50 million for enabling works, and they may have 1,000 new homes that they'd like to develop. What our thinking there is that we'll have a templated package of here it is. If you would like to use IFF, this is it. We don't see that as a huge negotiated arrangement. It would be, here's finance, we think it's highly competitive for you. We think your project, after we've gone through some due diligence work, so download it all, go and fill it out, and we think we could move through that. Yeah, so very much off the shelf. To do that for small projects. Our medium projects, the Tauranga System Plan's a good one, where councils bring a package of projects together and say that the totality of these 12, 15 projects is $200 million, could you provide 200? We think we could do a similar sort of off-the-shelf package there, and that could really streamline the system. And then thirdly, on large projects, so some of those very large-scale projects, they are going to be bespoke and they are going to be complicated, and you're probably going to be raising, getting into the $1 billion+ dollars. And so I think there'll be an acceptance that there's going to be many stakeholders be working through those. So look, that's a bit long-winded, but yes, IFF is complex. We recognise that it was there for a reason to provide protections, but we think we've got good modifications that can be made where we can make the IFF model more accessible to developers and to councils.
Cool. Any other reflections on IFF? I think it sort of leads us nicely into what is top of the pops here is around PPPs, and clearly we've talked about how IFF can learn and develop, and I think it's probably fair to say when PPPs were first introduced, similarly sort of challenges around complexity and sort of applicability to different projects. So I will start with you, Erin, but then I'm going to come on to you, Bevan. Has Treasury sort of done any reviews around PPPs and sort of what's worked? What can we learn from that? And then how can we sort of embrace the PPP model?
I don't know if there's been a specific review sort of the policy necessarily. There has been some work done by the Infrastructure Commission in this space, and because responsibility sort of moved between the different agencies when the Infrastructure Commission was brought in. So not specifically at this point in time.
There's coming though, maybe.
There is sometimes a little bit of confusion that is IFF really PPP? And I guess just to help people with that, IFF is a lot easier than PPP because under IFF, finance is being provided, but the financier has no relationship to the construction of the project, to the maintenance of the project, to the operation of the project. That's completely ring-fenced, and really so from a credit perspective, you really have a fantastic offering for financiers. You've got a statutory lien to collect revenue, you've got a lien over the land if people don't pay, and you don't have to expose financiers. Financiers don't need to risk construction, what happens with overruns, what happens if it never gets completed. They're divorced from that. So it is quite a nice little pure...
It's financing of a funding stream,
yes,
rather than financing of a construction risk and a sort of wrap, if you like, of integrated operations. So maybe, Bevan, your reflections on the PPP model and how it might be refined going forward.
I think, as Erin has said, the Infrastructure Commission's done some work on that. Is it not on?
No, just pull a little bit closer. There
All right.
we go.
So I think the Infrastructure Commission's done a bit of work on that, as Erin was saying, and I think where they got to is probably the same conclusion I would, in that you need a wide toolkit of options for funding infrastructure. I think they said something like, it should always be on the table for consideration, and you've got to think about that at business case stage. And I think if we step back for a minute and think about private finance generally, rather than necessarily just the PPP moniker, and what that might bring to the table, I guess it's a few things. So one is unlocking types of capital that wouldn't be available in another way. So you've got infrastructure investors, and we're talking both equity investors and debt finance, who want to invest in projects in the infrastructure and energy space. And they wouldn't just buy government debt or local authority debt. They actually want to manage and invest in projects. So if you didn't have a private finance focus, you would lose that investment. And that's a dollars thing, but it's also an expertise thing, because we're talking about people with a great deal of management capability who want to invest in the sector. Obviously, as well, private finance can bring a sort of robustness to looking at the business case, because you've got to look at how it adds up and what's the best use of funding or finance available. There are some areas, like as Sean was saying, in the IFF space, where effectively the private finance is completely additional to other finance options, because you're essentially hypothecating a distinct revenue stream with a financing attached to it. In other areas, you're using debt finance as a way of achieving your broader objectives on a project. So if you're looking at the whole of life position of a project and the entire cost of it, or you're looking at aligning who benefits from a project with who pays, then private finance can be really useful as well.
Just
Fair enough.
just to add to that as well, and I think it's, we would be thinking, Treasury would be thinking about it in terms of the business case, as Bevan was saying, and whether sort of the procurement approach, how that will also help to achieve the outcomes of the project.
And I think, I'll throw my 2 cents worth. Obviously there's been a range of PPP projects in Australia, and sort of, I guess your sort of measure of success, what works, what hasn't worked, is really varied, and it's not been a single reason for why it worked very well, some would say, as a PPP on the Gold Coast Light Rail. Some might say hasn't worked on the Metro Tunnel in Melbourne. And a lot of that is about the sort of level of development and risk profile that sits underneath that complex structure. Is it the right risk profile that basically the financiers pass it down to contractors anyway, so let's be real about that. Is it the right risk profile that the contractor can manage? And then the other part of it, I think, is what's sort of government's role in these projects. So inevitably we have our masters that want to involve themselves in potentially changing the scope of a project or changing the outcomes that they're trying to achieve, particularly when we're talking about long-dated 5-10-year delivery programs, and the flexibility that goes with the project finance structure that that's just not really there. And so I think we're sort of having lots of debates back home around what is the right type of project, how much flexibility do I need as government to involve myself in what is fundamentally a construction risk transfer, not just a financing stream. And so I think it will continue to evolve, and projects will sort of work out what's right, and there'll be political choices that sort of sit around that as well, no doubt, which I think we're hearing as part of this conference, but I won't touch on that. So maybe there's a question posed here just to generally what are the barriers to implementing value capture schemes in New Zealand, and I've sort of touched on some value capture in projects that I've been involved in around the development sort of contribution, how do I tap into the value of the landowners, windfall gains tax, those kinds of things. Open to the floor. Sean, you're nodding, start with you on...
Bevan might be more on value capture.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that the first thing is working out what the beneficiary zone is, isn't it? And there can be lots of debates around that, particularly if you're looking at sort of brownfields development where you're trying to capture value with existing property. It's somewhat easier in greenfields where you're looking to capture value from new property to be developed. But I would have said that's probably the biggest issue, identifying who's actually benefiting from a value capture perspective. Also, whether if you take, let's say you buy a property today in the expectation that there's going to be a value uplift, and you pay essentially for that today because you think there's going to be an infrastructure development. It's essentially the previous owner who's benefited from that rather than you necessarily from a value capture perspective. So you probably need quite a long lead time and when you're going to establish a value capture program. But ultimately you need to work out how much of the overall funding package is value capture, because it's one of probably a series of pieces in the jigsaw that you'd put together for a particular project.
And IFF is not really pure value capture.
No,
it has
it's just a charge.
it has attributes of it. A large chunk of the work that we do actually is, who are the beneficiaries, determine exactly who they are, identify them, and then how do you allocate between them? And they can be quite small groupings. So we've looked at, we're working on a couple of small greenfield type projects where the main beneficiaries are obviously the new houses that will come into the greenfield development, but there's some business parks on the other side of a state highway that will also get a benefit, and there's some wider benefits to citywide from just opening up some major transport arteries. And so, you do a lot of work, you get some economic analysis as well, and you determine the greenfield homeowners are going to have 75% of the value, the business park's going to have 15%, and the city's going to have X amount. So that sort of determination work that's critical to getting levies that are allocated and applied that are fair and reasonable and robust and will stand the tests of judicial review and other types of challenges.
And I might throw into that it's sort of perhaps easier in a greenfield sense when you start to introduce it into an urban sort of already existing development area, or not development area, but just an urban area. How do I determine what was just market value?
And brownfield
value?
Can be a bit more challenging, especially if you're really going to just give a like for like. If you've already got water pipes that go through the city and you're just putting in some new water pipes. But if it's actually, where greenfields can work quite well, and we did this in Tauranga, where there is obviously a roading system, but they had 12 multimodal roading packages that involve buses, walkways, cycleways and roads. And together, that actually added, because of the network effect of roading, it added a significant benefit to the entire city. And so all of the ratepayers in Tauranga became the beneficiaries and are all equally being levied the same amount. So that is a brownfield environment, but certainly greenfield is much clearer. And the other attraction of greenfield, and we at CIP did this with our very first project before IFF, we did a project up north of Auckland called Mildale, where with Fulton Hogan we worked, and there's 4,000 new homes being built.
You've got a question on this one, so
and
how do we measure success on Mildale?
Well, I think how we measure success on Mildale would be that the plan with Fulton Hogan was a plan to incrementally place infrastructure in the ground and to construct the homes over a 30-year period. And so it was a classic sort of developer of go into a super lot, put in some temporary infrastructure, just do as much as is required so that you can sell that lot, get cash flow, and then keep on doing that slowly. And that was a plan that would see 4,000 homes completed in around 30 years. The plan with Mildale was all of the finance that was required for the enabling works was provided on day one. The infrastructure started in October 2018. There's one final project, a bridge across the state highway. It's quite a significant bridge called the Highgate Bridge that will be completed this year. So the infrastructure's all in. There's 1,000 people living, 1,000 homes now in Mildale. There's a city centre that's half constructed. And that's been since the end of 2018. So, we would say that's success as opposed to waiting a 30-year period just to slowly, incrementally build out the township.
Any other reflections?
I mean, just on the value capture point, I think I'll just add that I think it's also about community acceptance and understanding of this. And so I think that's why talking about it much earlier, both in terms of theory, that this is another sort of user pays or beneficiary pays mechanism, as we do have a number at the moment. And so I think starting to sort of talk about that more in theory, so then it can be talked about in relation to specific projects as well, as important, as well as thinking about the the affordability element of that too. You know, is it that is going to have to be a factor? It's never going to be a sort of a perfect calculation. I don't necessarily think. You know, there's going to be a level of practicality or pragmatism that needs to be brought in too.
And I think it's sort of giving respect to the community, right, of being able to have that complex conversation. We have high community expectations for what our projects deliver. They need to also understand what we can afford and how they can contribute to that. And I think, you know, the Crossrail example's a good one, right? Government was very clear they couldn't afford it, but you want it, so will you contribute? And I think, you know, it took a long time. I'm not pretending that that happened overnight, but that community acceptance, I think, is fundamental to those sorts of models. Yeah. And take a slightly different tact on the last few minutes. Some questions here. We're obviously talking about new projects, sort of new structures that go in place. How do we think about funding and alternate funding when we start to think about the existing infrastructure and sort of maintaining what we already have and leveraging what we already have? Who wants to run with that one? I think it sort of sounds like a Treasury one to me, Erin. I'm sorry.
I mean, the one that comes to my mind, water, is the one that sort of, I guess, comes to my mind in theory. You know, there's a few councils around the country that did bring in water charges, user charges. So, you know, whether that's, again, but I think the principles are still the same. It's about understanding, you know, having a more sort of, I guess, mature conversation with communities about, you know, the level of affordability and the level of maintenance and that is needed to actually ensure the level of service that people want, and also things like, you know, thinking about the environmental impact. Water's a good example where you know, it can actually, having volumetric charging can bring down usage, which can bring down bill. You know, so I'm not saying that it will be cheaper necessarily, but I think it's understanding, you know, how the need for it. I think that it's not just, you know, another charge on people necessarily. I think it's actually having to have that discussion.
General thoughts on?
Well, IFF doesn't go into sort of operation and maintenance. We're very capital build new.
So I might say then, sort of just more generally, I think is a really interesting. So you're independent of your backgrounds. Do we think that the infrastructure and I really like this question, but is the infrastructure ambition fit for scale for New Zealand? Are we ambitious enough? By we, New Zealand. It's a nice little question to wrap up the.
I think there are like a bunch of tools that have been developed that are out there and they haven't been fully utilised, and you know, none of those tools are going to be the complete solution, but there are very substantial projects that are being worked on, and the funding stack for those projects is going to be multifaceted. And it's going to be old traditional funding tools and new traditional funding tools, and it's going to be a bit clunky. You know, we have examples where there's some projects that we're looking to fund and finance, and we're offering 30-year locked-in finance, so a council or project owner knows exactly what they're getting from us, and they see a lot of attraction with that. It's off their balance sheet. They know that funding is going to happen, so they know that part of the project's happening. There are other funding tools. You know, look at Waka Kotahi funding, for example, that's more on a 3-yearly cycle. So where you're building projects that span, you know, a decade or two, and you're looking to get your funding stack complete, you've got some tools such as IFF where, yes, you can tick that box and say, here's our X billion dollars of funding. But some of the more established funding tools that have historically worked in cycles, you know, how do you bring them also in so that you're getting commitments for the 30 years rather than just knowing you've got your first 3 years locked away?
Do we start to cap out though? You sort of go and put an IFF in place for one project and then the same region needs another project, can't put another IFF. Like, do we start to cap out?
Yeah, I mean, I'd sort of look to the counterfactual. Like, if these projects are going to occur, they're going to be funded one way or another. They're going to be funded by taxpayers, ratepayers, Crown grants, or tools like these. They're not, and really what IFF is offering to councils an off-balance sheet solution. It's offering to councils, you know, a greater tenor of lending. and it's offering to homeowners in many of these situations not having to pay all at once. So if you go like in the greenfield analogy, where the traditional model was a developer would pay a developer contribution when they get their title to the house, and that might be $40,000, and they charge the first homeowner $40,000. The counterfactual with IFF is you pay $1,000 a year and you spread that over the 30 or 40 years. So all the people that are going to be owners of that house in time, so it's a sort of a spreading. But I guess the point I'm making, and one that I guess has been made quite a bit, is it's going to be paid from, if the infrastructure is going to occur, it's going to have to be paid one way or another. And you know, we know the blunt obvious tools of tax and rates. And now we're starting to have tools that can look to actually spread out some of this and then treating people more fairly rather than imposing significant costs at once.
With a minute to go, are we ambitious enough?
I mean, I think that, you know, in terms of ambition, I think the area where we really need to get more ambitious is around sort of our existing assets and getting better use out of them, but also properly understanding the ongoing maintenance, renewals and replacement need around that. And I think that's a particular area where we do need to be more, you know, sort of cognizant of what that ongoing cost is, and that I think should be the starting point in terms of the level of investment.
I think we are quite ambitious, particularly if you look at, you know, the Infrastructure Commission's strategy. There's quite a big focus on ambition. I think we've been quite stop-start on implementation and on models. I agree with Sean, there are actually quite a few things available in the toolkit, but we kind of use them, then put them down. I think it's important to have a range of tools, but to use things that the market understands and we can repeat. And there'll be some transactions that are complex and really bespoke, but I think having a set of transaction structures that we roll out more regularly would be really good for infrastructure delivery and for the market generally.
Okay. We're out of time, but clearly there's a lot to talk about here, and so I'm sure you can find any of the panel members, myself, floating around the place and continue the conversation, but enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you,